sound?
We have sound.
Great.
Everything works.
Okay.
Great. Wait, talk a little more.
How does the sound?
This is Remix's Space, hosted by TechEquity.
So what? Yeah, I don't even know.
Ask questions. I'll answer them on the microphone.
What's Remix?
So Remix, I don't work for Remix, but they are like a cool transit company. They have interesting technology that you should ask somebody who works there about.
The coordination is great.
The coordination's great.
Yeah.
Sounds.
It's good. It's like a little roomy, but I'm sure it'll get
But
quiet.
it sounds, even sitting here, it's almost like I'm listening to myself in headphones. Like that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
It's a weird kind of surround sound system, knowing that if there is not surround sound.
I mean, we can just turn that off because we're actually just collecting.
Catherine Bracy. I talk like Catherine Bracy does. I don't know what she sounds like. But she's great, and we're really excited to have her here. So she's part of TechEquity Collaborative.
Maybe we should just move back closer because it is kind of echoey.
Do you want to? Okay. Good thing I can take this up.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Yeah. That's fine.
Oh, okay.
I guess we should wait 30 seconds and see what it sounds like. Nice, tight, great. Oh, my tooth. I'm always like the friend. Hello. Is it?
It's not. We're not caught up yet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Last night, Adam was like, I just feel like every time you walk into the room and look at me, you just sigh.
Oh.
I'm just like, not everything's about you.
I love you. Should you talk me to this? How's it going?
Oh, we're moving it right now. Ooh, there goes the tape. I just like we're all just talking to each other and that's what it's picking up.
Yeah. Well, what do you have it set on? Like the cardio pattern?
That's
It's on cardio?
fixed, yeah.
Oh, it's fixed. I see. Okay. Because I have one that's like it has different directions.
Oh, it's configured that.
Yeah.
I don't know this is.
I guess I could have brought that.
What if we just put it next to the speaker? Would that be too much?
Yeah, that's feedback city.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Alright, can you talk in the microphone?
Hello, yes, I can indeed.
Or no, just me. I'm not gonna say anything.
Oh, okay.
Talk like you're like just like talk about TechEquity.
So TechEquity Collaborative is an organization that educates and activates tech workers. Yes, in case you're curious, I'm going to let you know. So we host events like this, and we also do some organizing work around housing and workforce and labor. Very exciting. Thank you all so much for coming. This is a very fun test.
Alright, good. Well, now let's let it catch up.
Yeah.
One thing we could do is also put it on here.
So it doesn't collect all the sound?
Also ground echoiness we get.
Because the creaking is the worst part.
Yeah.
Maybe we should
Can you
switch.
grab one of those? Or yeah. That one. Yeah.
Just put it on the chair. Oh, no, leave it.
Yeah, it's actually not very good.
Yeah, it's because of the floor squeaking, I think. Okay, but find something else to put that on.
It's just picking up a lot of sound.
Yeah.
literally shook that up.
Okay.
All right, hello, this is another test. I'm here talking, and it's a great time. Hello, hello. I'm the stranger. This is my friend David Sassone, everybody. Say hi to David, everyone. Great. Nice. Oh, the power of a microphone. Don't you love it? I do.
Marion, what book are we going to talk about tonight?
We're going to talk about Generation Priced Out. Author Randy Shaw, chatting over here. Hello, Randy. How are you doing? Great. Just checking out the sound, so you can sound great. Oh, yeah.
All right, hang on.
Do you want a thing for that? I think that'll be easier. I don't know. I only saw that once. You could take one of these things. Yeah. Is it any better?
Just echoey. It's honestly, you need to listen to it. It's about caught up to you. You know what? I'm gonna talk.
that's
I'm gonna
better.
sit here and talk like I'm not in the microphone. So, and let's see if that makes it any better and less echoey.
I honestly think that this doesn't sound that bad at all.
Really, I think it's just maybe it's just because I've just been only listening to it. I think it sounds kind of echoey.
I mean, you can definitely hear the floor sound.
Yeah.
Can you talk on the microphone?
Today is Thursday, the last day of February, because it's a short month. And
It's like not any worse. It's like way better than audio quality.
sure, but does it sound good though? I feel like the bar is low. Does it sound better or worse with me not using the microphone?
Sounds quiet.
Quieter.
Let me try and add
I'm
more
also not
gain.
talking that loud, and like you'd be projecting more.
So I think the mic helps because then because the voices are loud, you can turn it down, and then the surrounding sound is
It's not as
respected.
much.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I think this is it.
Boom.
Nice. Nice. That's good. Did you bring your shirt? So that's a no. You just don't want to wear it? David, you better sit close to the front. Okay.
Welcome. I'm Bracy. I am founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. We are, is anyone first time to one of our events? Great. So we are a newish organization that is educating and activating tech workers around issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows here in the Bay Area, more people benefit from that growth. And of course, in order for folks to benefit from that growth, there must be abundant affordable housing. So housing is one of the main issues that we focus on here. So we're very thrilled to be able to talk to experts in this area like Randy, who we're going to get to in a second, to help understand more about why the affordability crisis is what it is and what we can do to help address it. So before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, we do have a code of conduct at our events. I'm sure everybody here is excited to learn, and we just want to make sure that this is a safe space for learning. So just respect the perspective that everybody is coming at this from, and make sure you're creating a space for everybody to get something out of this. You know, housing is a very touchy subject in the region, as we all know. We just want to make sure that we're all respecting everybody's opinion on the topic. And there's a written out copy of the Code of Conduct at the front desk if anybody wants to read through the whole thing. The other thing I want to say is that TechEquity is a membership-driven organization, and we depend on all of our members to help power our advocacy work. We're doing a lot of advocacy work, which we'll talk about in the conversation, but really we need you all to bring your voices to the table. So if you would like to join TechEquity, we would ask you to do that at the front before you leave today. It's $50 a year. It really helps us make much more impact in the space. So with that, I want to get into our conversation with Randy, who is an OG San Franciscan. He knows more about the city than just about anybody. He's the longtime director of the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, which is San Francisco's leading provider of permanent housing for homeless single adults. He's also the editor of BeyondCrown.org, which is a local news site that covers a lot of these issues, and is the founder of the Tenderloin Museum, which he encourages you to attend, it says here in the bio he shared with me, so nice plug. Where is it?
Eddie and Leavenworth.
What is it?
Eddie, you have to push this button?
Yeah, it's on now.
Eddie and Leavenworth, and we just had a great write-up in the...
There you go. Okay.
We just had a great write-up in the Chronicle about our current exhibit, so take a look at it.
What's the current exhibit?
Well, it has a matchbook collection, which we turn into books, plus historic ephemera from the Tenderloin from a collector. So it's one of our few special exhibits, plus you have a traditional permanent collection. Which, and if you go to History Days this weekend at the Mint, we'll have there'll be a booth for the museum. You can learn all about it.
He's also a prolific author. Previous books include The Activist Handbook and The Tenderloin, Sex, Crime, and Resistance in the Heart of San Francisco, which sounds quite juicy. And of course, his latest book, Generation Priced Out, which we have on sale at the front desk as well, if you want to grab a copy when you leave. I think for anybody, how many of you live in San Francisco? Yeah, I mean, if you live here, it really feels like a must-read. There's a lot of really interesting history about the city. So I suggest you pick it up. So we're going to get into it because there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. So Randy, can you just start by laying out the general argument of the book, and also just kind of, as part of that, what brought you to write it?
Well, let me start with that, because people often say to me, you know, they think because basically we run a large organization, house homeless people, and I'm associated with the Tenderloin and very low-income people, how I ended up writing a book about the working and middle class. And it really, this book came out of the Ghost Ship fire of December 2nd, 2016, as I'm sure you all remember, in Oakland. And when that fire occurred, I got a call from my longtime editor at UC Press. She said, would you be interested in writing a book about this? And I said, well, because we were talking about how, my first reaction was, you know, we used to always say that Oakland, we knew San Francisco wasn't affordable, but people, Bohemians and all, could always afford to live in Oakland. Now they can't even get safe places in Oakland. They're dying in a fire. And she said, would you want to write something about that? And I said, well, I'd only want to write it if I can write it the way I want to write it. And I'll send you a proposal. And what I said in that proposal, which became the book, was, if you've read books about gentrification, and I've read most of them, many of them, they all have the same kind of theme. A big developer or some big real estate interest comes in and evicts tenants and turns over and transforms a working class neighborhood into an upscale enclave. Right? We know the story. But actually, if you look at how gentrification more often occurs, particularly in San Francisco, and you can just think about these neighborhoods like Bernal Heights and the Haight-Ashbury and Noe Valley, where nothing ever gets built but have been completely gentrified, that what I wanted to write about was how all these progressive blue cities have land use policies that promote exclusion and elitism instead of inclusion and racial diversity. By their zoning policies, they don't want apartments be built and just preventing housing from being built. And so I wrote a different kind of book assessing the causes of gentrification and how to make housing more affordable. And that's how, and then I discovered along the way the generational divide, which became kind of the core of the book.
And I mean, I mentioned the history of the city. That is very important. I don't know how many of you have lived here for more than 10 years? Okay, more than...
That's unusual, yeah. because Joe Fitz of the Examiner just did a thing where he said, Stockton Street's reopening. It hasn't been open since 2012. I mean, who's it? And he said something like, who's even seen it ever open? And I said, Joe, are you saying that there's that few people who were here before 2012? He said, based on my readers, yes.
Yeah, that's when I moved here.
So people don't know what happened in the past. And I think that affects how we viewed the recent present and maybe the future.
Yeah, and it makes it really hard to have a conversation about solutions to the housing crisis because everyone wants to look at what happened in the last 10 years as sort of the
How
cause.
about the last 2 years?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. So I'm hoping that you can kind of hit us with a little bit and not all of it because there's a lot and folks really, I mean, the book is so rich in that history, but just like talk through how the seeds were planted decades ago to get us to where we are.
The short answer, which really is very simple, is starting in the late, after World War II, people's parents of mine moved for just what's called suburbia. And there's a whole ocean of material on suburbia, and we're going to find out, I think, when we look back, that suburbia lasted for a very short time in America, because before World War II, people with money lived in cities. It was only after World War II that changed. So what happened was people who were who were in their 20s in the late 70s decided they wanted to move back to the city. And we had something which some of you may recall the term yuppie, younger and professional. That's what people were called, returning to the cities. And it happened in all the it happened in San Francisco, Boston, New York, where people whose parents grew up in the suburbs, they grew up in Great Neck, New York, or they grew up in Walnut Creek, now they wanted to live in the city. Well, when you bring in all those people, and then San Francisco is building downtown development as a new economy, and they're building downtown high-rises to have jobs for these young people, wouldn't you think that maybe the city should build some housing because we have all these jobs, increased population, but we didn't. And what's remarkable as I look back is throughout almost the entire 1980s, no one said, we really should be building some housing for all the new population and jobs because rents keep going up. But in those days, the left believed that the whole key was, quote, make downtown pay its fair share. And that if we got the downtown office buildings to contribute to affordable housing and transit, that's all we needed. Mayor Feinstein downzoned half the city, because she wanted to there were a lot of ballot measures to stop downtown development. In order to get the west side of the city to not support those ballot measures, she said, don't worry, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to downzone all of your neighborhoods, not let any apartments be built in the whole west side.
Yeah, and can you just say, what is downzoning?
Downzoning means that you used to be able to build apartment buildings on the west side until the late 70s, early 80s when Mayor Feinstein stopped that. Now you might think, well, how can that be? Mayor Feinstein, the most pro-development mayor we've ever had. But you see, development in San Francisco, when we talk about who's pro-development, we're usually talking about downtown development. And Mayor Feinstein was all for downtown high-rise development, none of which at the time was housing. But when it comes to the deal was, we're going to protect the neighborhoods. And believe it or not, there weren't YIMBYs or TechEquity folks in the 80s saying, this isn't going to work because we're adding all these people of high incomes and we're not building any housing. It's really going to cause rents and home prices to skyrocket, which it did. but we didn't make it an issue. There was a big 87 mayor's race, like the future of the city. I worked on it as a volunteer almost full-time after work, you know, because we thought it was downtown versus neighborhoods, and neighborhoods won. Neither candidate talked about the need to build more housing. It was rather remarkable.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's a little bit of negligence in there, like how could you not have planned for this? But also like active, you know, there was a reason that Dianne Feinstein, it was politically...
You couldn't build in most of the city because where they used to build is the west side. And I describe in the book my friend Joe Cassidy, and I sort of traced through the story of builders and what it meant. You know, he would build, they'd spend a year building a house, and the market wasn't there, and they could often, it took them a year to sell it. They used to call their broker on a Monday, and they'd say, did anyone come to our open house? Now that might strike a lot of you as shocking, given how we've come. And you know, one of the reasons, and I describe this in the book that's often overlooked, in that era, if you bought a 4-unit building as an owner and moved into 1 unit, you removed the rest of the building from rent control. So instead of buying Joe Cassidy's newly built single-family home, hey, go buy a 4-unit Victorian in the Haight with long-term tenants, evict to move in, and then 6 months later you can raise all the rents to market. So there was almost a competition which prevented people from building.
And so this was like, when was Dianne Feinstein mayor?
She became mayor in '78 in the assassination, November '78, and she was there till '87.
Okay, so this is basically the 80s.
Yeah.
Before anybody was really using the internet, you know.
Right.
So these are all like decisions, and 1978 also happens to be the year that Prop 13 passed. So there's kind of state policy also happening that's changing, drastically changing land use. Can you just, for those who don't know what Prop 13 is, just say?
Well, Prop 13, the homeowner revolt against their property taxes, which is unfunded education in California ever since, and caused other problems in the public sector.
Strike.
Yeah. So, but Prop 13 was this homeowner revolt, and actually, the impact took a while to take. So it was not as impactful in the 80s because the economy was booming. Because of the way Reagan structured the tax cut of '81, there was all this money put in. So the whole national economy began declining in the late 80s, and it declined for almost 10 years.
So, and Prop 13 change also, you know, created sort of land use issues that also were happening. My point is, like, in that period of time, there were, you know, there were decisions that were made. Right. It was negligence, we didn't plan for it, but also like actively making policy that we're living with, you know, the effects of now.
That's correct, yes.
You know, about 10 years ago, I'd say, is sort of when the second tech boom started.
Or 2012. 11, 12, yeah.
That's, yeah,
yeah.
I'm getting close to 10 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mayor Lee became mayor right around that time, and I think that's what people, in their mind, that is history.
Yeah, you know what's interesting that I found just amazing during that, starting in 2011, is the worst time, and it's not even close statistically, the worst time for evictions, rent increases, every indicia of skyrocketing housing affordability and displacement was from 1997 to 2000. I mean, it's not even close. The number of evictions doubled, of no-fault evictions. The dot-com boom was a dramatic impact which completely gentrified most of San Francisco.
The first one.
Yes. When the second tech boom happened in 2012, it made gentrified neighborhoods more expensive. Okay? This was the big myth that was floated, that somehow the tech boom was gentrifying neighborhoods. Well, Bernal, Potrero Hill, tell me what neighborhood wasn't gentrified. Well, like the Tenderloin, we're never going to be gentrified. We're an exception. And I wrote a book about why that is. But the reality is that there was a lot of real dishonesty, which continues to this day, where they claim things are causing gentrification, and places like Bernal Heights are completely 100% gentrified. Yes, they have a public housing thing at Alamany Projects, but all the existing housing stock is $1 million homes. Every house in San Francisco goes for $1 million or more. If you can get one for $1 million, you're lucky. But there's this myth that many of these so-called progressives float, which is somehow we're driving working class homeowners away. What are they talking about? They've been driven away by the anti-housing policies of the last 30 years.
I mean, I would argue that if you own a home in San Francisco right now, it's hard to think of yourself as working class.
Well,
You've got
you know,
$1 million asset.
there are people who bought houses. I knew them when I lived in Noe Valley, and who were working class and who don't have any assets. And since they're not selling their house, they're not drawing on the assets. But increasingly what we've done is say, if you're going to live in Noe Valley in the future, you're either going to be a millionaire or the child of millionaires who can fund you. And what's astonishing is how so-called progressive elected officials don't seem to have any problem with that. It's the real core hypocrisy of San Francisco, that we have people who think it's totally fine to let only rich people move into a neighborhood so long as you don't displace the existing people there. That doesn't make any sense. And that's what my book is kind of about, because it's not just in San Francisco. We have similar attitudes in about a dozen cities, which I write about, that are remarkably parallel to what we see in San Francisco.
Yeah, and I want to get to that for sure, because I do think that we're definitely in ground zero.
Yes.
But it's very interesting to see how these dynamics play out in other cities. And speaking of the dynamics, I think what I'd really like to get into is the political dynamics, because this isn't just a affordability crisis, it really is a political crisis. And I think as I've been working on housing over the last couple of years, it's become very clear to me that it's not that we don't have answers. I think we all know exactly what we need to do to solve the housing crisis. The challenge is that we don't have the political will. And
I think we do now. I think those of you
we're going to get to that part. Don't whirl in the. We're going to take them down into a valley, and then we're going to bring them back up to.
Let me tell you how bad things were at the state level.
Right. We're
so
in the
you
bad.
can appreciate where we
We're
are.
in a dark place right now.
How bad things were was that for years, before Governor Brown killed redevelopment in 2011, which
Okay,
I
you're
think,
gonna have to explain that part too.
Well,
what is redevelopment?
Redevelopment was a way in which, if you declared something a redevelopment area, the tax increase generated in that area would stay in that area. And without going into a long discussion, it was supported by many affordable housing people, because there was a part of the redevelopment law which said 20% of the money has to go to house affordable housing.
And it was $1 billion a year, the
and
primary stream for affordable housing developers in California.
Right, it was. I was a very strong opponent of redevelopment. I stopped redevelopment from coming to mid-market. I stopped it from coming to the Tenderloin. We think we're both are better off as a result. But here's the key point I want to mention about this. Before there was talk of killing redevelopment, it was realized that all of these cities were not using the 20% legally, right? The law says, we're going to let you have all this redevelopment money, but 20% has to go to affordable housing. What happened to all those places that weren't spending on affordable housing? What do you think happened to them? What is the penalty? How about nothing? So, wait a second. That doesn't seem right. We have a state law, counties are violating it. Why don't some legislature, why don't we pass a bill to take away some of their money for violating the law, right? Couldn't get it passed. Did anyone know the city of Roseville? A good friend of mine is from there. They fought it like crazy because Roseville liked to build shopping centers. They're great at shopping centers because they get the sales tax revenue because of Prop 13. So the League of Cities really should be renamed the League of Supporting Illegal Conduct by Cities, because they fought it, so we lost. They couldn't get it happen. Isn't that incredible? That's how low. And then, with Governor Brown, he doesn't believe in affordable housing, doesn't believe in funding affordable housing. And so when he killed redevelopment, what he should have done is just say, okay, we're going to keep the housing funding in the general fund, because they could do that very simply. But he didn't want to do that. He vetoed and stopped. He's very clever. He didn't have to actually veto things. He just would tell the legislature, I'm going to veto it, so that it would stop. So like the $75 fee for real estate transactions, which became law in 2017, it was stopped previously by Brown twice.
Yeah, so we're starting to see this like crazy layering, twisted web of long-standing policy decisions at the state and local level that have gotten us to where we are. But again, like why it's really hard to untangle those knots, from my perspective, is really political. And you lay out several of the political dynamics or political tensions that I think make this particularly hard.
Well, Yeah, I would say this. The thing that I learned most in writing this book is I knew about homeowner associations and the power they have to stop housing, but I did not know how powerful they were in some cities. And San Francisco does not have anywhere near the more powerful homeowner associations. Where you really see the power is in places like Austin, Texas, Seattle. You might have noticed today in the paper, Paul Koretz, who represents Westwood and Bel Air and the upscale Los Angeles West Side homeowners, said that his problem with SB 50, they have to take LA out of it. So
SB 50 is Scott Wiener's.
Scott Wiener's bill. But the point being is that LA, they call them, Mike Davis had the line that I use in the book, the Sunset Bolsheviks, the people living off Sunset, but they're Bolsheviks in that they want nothing built, no apartments. The hillside groups in LA don't even want ADUs built, in-law apartments. They don't want anything built, and it's great for increasing property values for the existing homeowners. It's a great strategy. And, but what you have at these enormously powerful, primarily white of affluent homeowner groups who have just dominated local politics. And one of the reasons they were dominating in places like LA is LA has historically had off-year elections for local offices. So if you're running for city council, the voter turnouts in LA have been like 20%. They were 17% the last one. And so who votes in those microscopic turnout elections? White homeowners. So the council members are only caring about what they say. Now that's changed, and now starting in 2020, they're going to be connected to state and national elections. And I recommend in the book that like San Francisco, we got rid of one of our low turnout elections, but
except we have a mayoral election.
We do, but those are not historically low turnout. We used to have one that had the treasurer, the sheriff, and like really low. We got rid of it, but our supervisor races are always been held on even numbered years, and that's the problem in many places. They hold their council races in off-year elections where the tenants don't vote, the young people don't vote, the older homeowners vote. So that's a critical thing, but. Anyway.
So we've got, the NIMBY, so this is actually one of the political dynamics I want to talk about, because I think it is, why it's hard for us to break out of this, and actually do the things we know we need to do, because NIMBYs are they're politically powerful, and they vote. On the other, I would call it the pro-housing side of the issue. We end up in these weird political factions inside that pro-housing group, which makes it really hard to get anything done. And so I would call it the YIMBYs, and then the kind of tenant anti-displacement groups who end up fighting each other instead of focusing on the NIMBYs. That's what it feels like a lot to me. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
It's interesting. So this may surprise you, but until the last few years, we hardly ever had anybody going to City Hall and testifying for a housing development unless they were connected to the project themselves. They're in the neighborhood. We now call the YIMBY folks and all the people who always are turning out the hearings, they were never there in any city. They would come out, the only people, I was involved in projects, and we've turned out a lot of people. It's things we had a direct interest in, not how it is now, which is there's housing in this neighborhood, I support housing. So there wasn't even that alternative view. So you'd have the neighborhood coming out saying, don't do this. And the only people in favor of it were connected to the developer or the people the developer turned out. So that dynamic has changed. In terms of the issue with the tenant issue is what's happened.
And this is one of the political kind of tensions I want to talk about, which is the class race tension as well.
Here's the situation. I'll give the very, very truncated version, is that I was very involved in rebuilding the tenants movement after a series of devastating defeats. Prior to 1992, no tenant ballot measure had ever won in San Francisco. Does that surprise people? Because you think everyone had lost. And in 91, there was a vacancy control referendum which lost in a landslide. And
what is vacancy control?
Vacancy control is rent control in vacant apartments, which the Costa-Hawkins Act, we had Prop 10 prohibits since then. That passed in 95. But
so that means if someone moved out of the apartment,
you charge a rent a limited amount, right?
It would stay at the rent.
Or with a slight bump up. But the point being is that the tenant movement, such as it were, had a lot of people who liked to be seen in public and talk to the media, but not people who understood messaging or doing the hard work. So I reconfigured it in '92. We won our first ballot measure then, the biggest transfer of wealth from landlord to tenant in the history of the United States, because we cut the annual rent increase in more than half. And the whole strategy that we used was to focus on a broader economic message and aligning with liberal homeowners and not just tenants. Before, the tenants movement was like, okay, walk precincts in the Mission and Haight because that's where we're strong. We decided, we focused primarily on the Richmond. So we won that election, we won almost every election ever since. And then what happened was I started to move off into focusing on the Tenderloin, and then in 2014, Ted Gullickson of the Tenants Union died. And since that time, I think that there's just the so-called what we call the tenants movement is really has become very sectarian. And so when I saw the rising rents of the tech boom, the second tech boom, I thought this is great in the sense that we've got all these new people angry about their rents. We've just expanded and multiplied the tenants movement, right? Because all of the YIMBYs that I know are tenants. So, and they're angry about housing costs. So this is just what we needed, an influx of new angry people. But some of the tenant groups were so anti-tech, and they made it very clear, and to make it clear to this day, they're not interested in expanding housing opportunities for tenants who don't currently live in San Francisco. They're only interested in saving the people in my office. We have a law office, we represent people in Ellis Act evictions. They want to make sure that all the people who've been here for 30 years and 40 years are saved, which of course we support. But over time, the percentage of tenants with these long-term leases are smaller and smaller. So our tenants, the groups that claim to represent tenants, represent fewer and fewer people. And so what you now see is them becoming politically almost irrelevant. That the supervisors are pro-tenant because the millennials and the YIMBYs are pro-tenant. But there was this fiction created that the YIMBYs were anti-tenant. And I say fiction because no matter how many times groups can take positions in favor of things, people will find someone on Twitter who said something, and therefore they speak for the entire constituency. So that, yeah.
So, I mean, in fairness, I do think that the YIMBY movement rose out of a place of, I mean, their agenda at the beginning was really about we need to build more housing.
Right.
There wasn't an initial focus on tenant rights.
In the big picture, there's obviously people who believe in building more housing, who are libertarians, who don't think there should be inclusionary zoning, who don't believe there should be any restrictions, that you just build, build, build. I get that. But I think if you look at the people who've actually been involved for the most part, they tended to support tenants' rights and the like. But the point is, there was this need, I think, to demonize people who were similar to themselves demographically because they're either threatened by them, they didn't want to work together, their leadership, whatever. But it's crazy. But it also doesn't really matter as much as, I don't think it matters as much as you may think it matters. Because I think we're moving forward now politically. I think the mayoral election, I think, was very significant in San Francisco because there were two ways to go. There was one candidate who made it very clear we need to build more housing, and two who said we didn't. And the one who said we did won. And I don't think we should downplay that victory, because that victory has been repeated in city after city under similar circumstances.
So when I started working on this issue, and I came at it from a very naive place, 3 years ago, I didn't know anything about housing, but I had a hypothesis that I assumed would be proven wrong because, if this was true, why hadn't anyone done it yet? But that there was, like you were saying, a lot of common ground and, shared self-interest among people like us, who younger, newer to city renters, and the long-time, lower-income, working-class communities of color who are also primarily renters, and that we had common cause here. We could figure out how to develop a shared political agenda and build this coalition. Like, why hadn't that already happened? There must be some reason here.
Well, there is one critical reason. I'm sorry.
Well, I just think that one element in this that is very important that we should not gloss over is this sort of the importance of race in the conversation.
Well, the only problem is the people of the tenants union, for example, and how all the tenant groups are run by white people outside of just cause. So I mean, the tenants union has always been a white organization.
Yeah,
so
in San Francisco.
Yeah, in San Francisco. So and so is the Housing Rights Committee has always been a white organization. And they hired a recent people who aren't. But I mean, I'm just saying, Ted Gullickson was a white man, and he was the face of the tenants union for 22 years. So. To me, it's more that various progressive pro-tenant, someone like Hillary Ronan's a good example, very closely aligned with anti-housing and homeowners. Aaron Peskin is aligned with anti-housing homeowners. When I talk in the book about there was a measure that became Home SF, do people remember Home SF? It was a measure to have a density bonus for affordability, and because the planning department wasn't thinking strategically, in 2016, when they proposed it, they called it the Affordable Housing Density Bonus Plan. That's not really good marketing, huh? Affordable. And it got so overwhelmed with opposition, it didn't even get to a supervisor's vote. So Mayor Lee brings Katie Tang and says, let's rename it and call it Home SF. Passes unanimously the next year. But I think what that showed was like groups like the tenants union were all involved in stopping density bonuses because it was their political allies. And so this is the thing that I keep exposing is, and even now, is we have a so-called progressive board of supervisors in San Francisco, and yet why aren't they legalizing apartments citywide? Why are they supporting mansions over apartments? I think it's indefensible, really. I mean, we're supporting, you can build a mansion, but not an apartment. How is that progressive? So I think the more that comes out there, the more we'll see where it goes. So I think we're going to see some progress. But I think the tenant group, is because they're aligned with certain elected officials.
Yeah. Well, I mean, San Francisco is, I say it's ground zero, but it also is a rough example because there really aren't that many low-income renters, communities of
who
color
aren't subsidized
left,
right,
left
right.
in the city.
Well,
and you write about Oakland a little bit in the book, and I think that's where the racial dynamics do become.
Here's an example of Oakland, though, I can mention, which is that Oakland does not have inclusionary housing, which means all the housing they're building on Broadway, when you see it open, there will not be one affordable unit in any project, not one. Why is that? Well, one reason is progressives and tenant groups did not push for inclusionary zoning law. Why? Does anyone know why they did not push for an inclusionary housing in Oakland? Does anyone know why?
Why they didn't, or why?
Why the tenant groups and the progressive groups did not push for inclusionary zoning law? Because they don't want market rate housing. Okay. And inclusionary means that it's like 80% and 85% market rate and 15% affordable. Okay, they didn't want that, but the market rate housing got built anyway with 0 affordable units. So I don't think that was a good strategy.
So in fairness, I do want to be fair to
fair.
Because we work closely with a lot of these groups as well, and I think that it is true that there are some groups who are just like, F capitalism, we don't think there should be private ownership of land, so like we're against everything. But there are other groups who are really genuinely concerned and coming from a place of good faith that like they see all this development in their community, none of it is really for them. And when it happens in the short term, and this is true at the very micro like block level, which is where people live their lives, the rents on the block go up in the short term, and they don't have time to ride that out. And so it's coming from a place of fear, but it's not a bad faith fear.
Well, no, I'm saying it's poor strategizing, because all of this market rate housing is being built as we speak. So they didn't stop any of it.
Right, like they're not looking at the bigger picture. I will give you that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see.
But I'm trying to get back to my Randy. Yeah. I'm trying to get back to my point about the political tension and where we have, the YIMBY groups who, historically, I guess, and by reputation, have been more about pro-development at all costs, full stop, versus sort of the anti-gentrification, anti-displacement, protect communities where they are, who end up fighting each other. And what I'm trying to say is there is a space there to carve out for common cause. And you say this, and I want to ask you to just read this couple sentences. because this will get us out of our little valley.
And also, I do
solutions.
talk about this in Minneapolis, where and I discussed the need to combine affordability with market rate, and they had a very good deal made at the St. Paul auto plant, where a great deal was made, and there's a lot of great deals that can be made, and are being made, but you have to be open to doing that. Yes.
So just those underlined sentences there when you're talking about the two.
With improving?
No, here.
This often heated conflict between these perspectives creates the false impression they are mutually exclusive. They are not. Cities can and must expand housing opportunities for the middle class and strengthen tenant and rental housing protections. And cities can and must promote deeply affordable housing for low-income residents and change zoning laws to allow multi-unit buildings and single-family home zone neighborhoods. And that's really the essence of the whole book. You pick the exact sentences that are really the essence of the book, because this is what I'm saying is that this notion, you have to do all these strategies, and people who just think you can build are wrong, obviously. You know, it's wrong, because it doesn't deal with anything with the protecting existing tenants. But people who think you can just protect existing tenants and that building causes more displacement are also wrong. And what frustrates me is that there are actual visible examples, neighborhoods like I always mention Bernal Heights, Haight-Ashbury. They don't let anything ever get built. Noe Valley, you can't build anything. Yet every house there in Noe Valley is now $1.6 to $2 million. So if development is the cause of gentrification, how do you explain all these San Francisco neighborhoods where there's been no development? There's been no development in most of those Los Angeles neighborhoods I mentioned. There's been no development in the Seattle neighborhoods because they haven't allowed it. Yet prices have gone through the roof. So obviously not building doesn't solve the affordability problem.
So, and this is, it's not do we protect communities or do we build new housing? We have to do both at the same time. And not just we have to do both at the same time in parallel, but I think that they're self-reinforcing. Like we can't really do building if we haven't created strong protections for people.
And think of this, in San Francisco we have the strongest tenant protections in the United States. There isn't any city that comes close to our level of protections. And they're even far more sweeping than you people here know. I'm just telling you, we have rental housing protections that no one else has. When I tell people in other cities how, oh yeah, we told them that if they're going to demolish that building, they have to replace it with deed restricted rent controlled housing. They said, how'd you get away with that? Well, I wrote a ballot measure, and to make sure it wasn't on the ballot, they agreed. I mean, but we have a lot of opportunities, a lot of tools. But then you pass all those laws, and housing affordability is still going crazy.
Yeah, it's a both and.
You got to build.
Yeah. So now we're getting to the hopeful part. When I started, thinking there must be this common ground we can stake out, where is it? It was really frustrating to find that often, and something I will never forget for the rest of my career is last year during the committee hearing for Scott Wiener's bill to upzone within a half mile of transit, the vice mayor of Beverly Hills sitting up there claiming he was with the people and an advocate for anti-displacement and low-income communities of color. How we created the political conditions for him to stand up there and claim to be that person, that's our fault, right?
Absolutely.
And so our goal is to try to fix that, right? And have people focus where, and it's starting to happen. So let's talk about solutions. Like, where are we seeing the green shoots where that is starting to happen?
Well, what happened in that 827 is one thing you want to never do is give your opponents the chance to challenge you on process. And Scott skipped some steps down in Southern California, opening the door for all these Beverly Hills and Los Angeles. No one talked to us. Okay. So Scott was smart, and he talked to them this year. So now they can't say they
with
won't talk
the help of TechEquity Collaborative. I would like to say
Great,
facilitated a lot of those conversations.
That's very
and
good.
you will
Thank
notice
you.
that bill has been filed for several months and no one has said anything.
Yeah, no, I think that I know Nancy Skinner from college, and I'm very involved. We followed each other
She's
for a
our
long
East
time.
Bay senator.
Yeah, the East Bay senator, and I think that Scott's got some baggage with certain equity groups that Nancy doesn't have, and I think we're heading in a good direction, and it's going to be a transformative year. I think I'm very optimistic about where things are going. part of my optimism, Jerry Brown was just, I remember I talked to reporters after he was leaving. They said, well, I mean, what do you think of his legacy? And he was like terrible on housing. He was an F. He only signed any housing bills for the first time in 2017 under penalty. Like the mayors came up and forced him. But Gavin Newsom, how many people here know Gavin at all or had experience with Gavin? I'll tell you, this is what I always say about Gavin. I know Gavin. There's a few things he really, really, really knows well, and two of them are housing and homelessness. He has passionate views, he's engaged, and there's a lot of subjects he doesn't know real well, like high-speed rail. But the ones he does know well, he wants to be the housing governor. He wants to be the guy. So I think he will give us that extra push that we didn't have last year. Things became a train wreck last year in 827, but SB 50, the push over the finish line, I think he'll want to be at that signing ceremony getting credit for it.
Yeah, and SB 50 is the comeback version of Scott Wiener's transit-oriented development bill, which this year has more of the kind of affordability and protection elements that a lot of the anti-gentrification activists were concerned about last year. So hopefully there will be enough, coming together on that.
I think there will, and I think also in the big picture, and if you read the book, and I hope you do, you'll see that because what's happening here is happening in all of these cities. It's not just San Francisco or Berkeley or Oakland, and that what is really going on in the country right now is after a long period of time when a demographic minority was able to control how cities use their land, that is being challenged as never before. The rise of the YIMBY movement has totally changed how we treat everything and the climate crisis. And we have environmental groups just coming in yesterday for SB 50. Environmental groups in Seattle are leading the way on housing issues and in Portland because they realize that you cannot have 120,000 people driving from Sacramento to the Bay Area and then say, oh, but we have solar panels and we're doing composting. No, it doesn't work that way. Buying a Prius isn't enough. You cannot say that you're not going to let people live in your city and you have to commute an hour, causing greenhouse gas emissions to evolve. So I think we're at a period now where the politics are changing. It's not as easy or as fast as some of us would like, but the momentum is there. And I think you're seeing things in Austin. Let me just say this Austin story, because I'm so impressed myself, and I always write about it if you've seen it, is that, so in Austin, they spent 3 years on a land use revision process. Austin is one of the most segregated cities. It's the most segregated major city in the United States.
It's the only growing city in the country that is losing its black population.
That's right. And
or it was a couple years ago.
And it's a city whose mayor bemoans the loss of that population. We have to do something. So they came up with this plan, because what Austin did after World War II is rezone all their neighborhoods so African Americans couldn't use the GI Bill to buy homes. They made a minimum lot size bigger than the GI Bill allowed. So they have a long history they're trying to change. 3-year process on again, why they called it Code Next. Bad, it's like affordable housing density. It's like this wonkishness.
Sounds like a coding boot camp.
Yeah, but that was the name. And after 3 years, this last August, the mayor decides, you know what, it's become so divisive and vicious, the fight over Code Next, we just got to put it down and start over. Big victory for the homeowner groups who don't want anything built anywhere in Austin. But there was an election in November, and the leader of the neighborhood groups ran against the mayor. And people thought it'd be a close election. It was all about the future of Austin. And the opponent was saying, keep Austin for Austinites, i.e., we don't care about the newcomers. We don't want to hear the complaints from millennials so they can't find a place to live. We only care about the real Austin people who've been here for 10 or 20 years. People thought it'd be a close election because of all the hearings were always very divisive. The incumbent mayor, pro-housing mayor, won by 40%, 60 to 20. That does not seem to me to be a city that's split. There was a ballot measure the anti-housing people put on that said any rezonings has to go to the ballot. That lost. A $250 million housing bond, which is a lot for Austin, won. My point of this is that when they finally got the chance for the whole big universe of Austin to vote, they were overwhelmingly for housing. But when we had these Thursday afternoon hearings and charrettes that were scheduled, it seemed like the city was split. And I think that same result would happen in all of our cities if there was a real, and that's why we just have to make sure necessary to make it more political.
Okay, so what are the opportunities that people are going to have to say, to make their voice heard? I mean, we'll have, through influencing their legislators at the state level, there's a lot happening at the state level. There was just a process that wrapped up here that I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about in the Bay Area called CASA.
Yeah. Well, it is happening. Now, if you're all in San Francisco, how many do you, because I mean, really, then your representatives are already on board. But I will tell you
at the
that
state level.
At the state level, you know, I mean, Scott Wiener, David Chu, and Phil Ting are on board on this stuff.
Yeah.
But if you have friends in other places, family, and you know, and you should find out it's not as clear, and they need to, even people who are sympathetic in the South Bay need to hear from people, because you know, look at the people in Cupertino and what they're telling their representatives. Palo Alto, different messaging. So this is a great opportunity for those of you who have South Bay connections, and the East South Bay, as we used that word before. You know, those folks, you know, it'd be great to do that, because this is, we have the opportunity to do something this year that would be historic, legendary, whatever word you want to use. But I do believe we are going to rezone California this year. I mean, we're rezoning California. These folks don't realize what's going on. Maybe I shouldn't say it in a public forum like this, but I'm telling you, I said to Scott Wiener, when I saw him at that event you guys did at Manny's, I said, Scott, you know, the way I'm looking at this, aren't we essentially rezoning almost all of San Francisco and the rest of the state? He goes, yep.
Yeah. So, okay, so I just want to go through the agenda a little bit.
Yeah.
So, SB 50,
yeah.
There's also some important tenant bills that are gonna...
Well, the tenant bills, whether we get statewide just cause, I don't know, because the question is always, if the realtors aren't happy, they just do a referendum. And I find it hard to believe we can actually, if we pass it, great, statewide just cause and a rent gouging limit, like Oregon. You know, does everyone know Oregon just passed statewide rent control and just cause eviction? That's a state that used to ban rent control. They just passed a statewide bill, zoomed it through. I mean, in 2 months, the whole process is over and signed.
Yeah.
Why can't California start doing some stuff?
Because...
Yeah, we know why. Powerful real estate interests. But I think that the CASA model,
so CASA,
getting
yes.
the buy-in, the CASA is this model where a broad Bay Area coalition came together to say we all will support this, and it included development issues, it included, you know, a whole range of every aspect of housing, but it also included a cap on rents and a statewide just cause, which has been dear to the hearts of many tenant people. Just so you're clear, what I'm saying is that in California, whenever anything passes for tenants at the local level or state, usually landlords go to the ballot and do a referendum. So just because even if we get it passed, doesn't mean you still have to win on the ballot, which is hard. But the CASA process has brought a lot of players from industry to stand behind a tenant bill, which has not happened before.
Yeah, so CASA, it was a kind of table process convening by MTC, which is the Regional Transportation Authority, and they did it because there is no regional authority in the Bay Area, despite the fact that we are a regional housing market. And it's one of the reasons why we can't get a lot done, is because nobody has the authority to, you know, mandate stuff for the region. They convened it for lack of there being anybody else to convene it. And I was skeptical. It started about 2 years ago that it's just going to be like yet another set of conversations. But they really did succeed in getting tenant groups. So they call it the 3 Ps: production, preservation, and protection. And got people, developers, tenant protection people, preservation, like let's, you know, keep affordable housing from being demolished, all to agree somehow on, I mean, now not all of it is as strong as everybody wants each piece of it to be, but it is, you know, just, it's not really about what the commitments were, it's about the process they went through, and they got to this place where I think we are seeing the coming together and agreement of people who recognize that this is such a problem that we need to stand up against the NIMBYs. And the people who are against CASA, what came out of CASA, are called the livable cities, livable California, they call it. They want to protect the character of their communities.
Well, the apartment association also came out against
Well,
it.
they signed, I mean, they were in the process and
Yeah.
they signed on to it, and then they came out with some letter, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. But
Right.
the point is that we are starting to see places where these sides who were not talking to each other at all are coming together and advocating, and that agenda now is at the state level and hopefully will be,
I think
passed.
you know the best indicia of where we are is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is the leading anti-development engine of Southern California. Just put out this big report attacking the Garcettification of Los Angeles, and they also said that they attacked every single member of the LA City Council for being a sellout, and corrupt, which I thought was great, because now they didn't have any I thought they'd already burned all their bridges. Now they're really burned, but it shows how desperate they are. They don't even think they can ever get their votes, and they're saying we know Garcetti is going to be for SB 50, because you remember Garcetti was against 827 last year. He was against the transit density bill, and when he went against it, it died. LA went against it in total last year. Now it's different.
Yeah, so anyway, with that, hopeful note, want to open it up to questions? Yeah?
So I come from a climate background and former Oaklander, and I'm all for transit-oriented development. However, kind of going back to what you're saying about the racial dynamics, what I hear is that a lot of these communities, historically Black, historically Latino communities, are saying, all the new development is coming in our neighborhood, we're taking all the hit, we're taking all the change. It's not happening in Rockridge, it's not happening in Pacific Heights. How do you thread the needle of saying, well, yes, we are going to upzone all of California? How do you make sure that those communities are also absorbing some of
I'm
the...
really glad.
Can I rephrase it as, because I think this is an important point. How do you make sure that the communities who were actively exclusionary, who wrote exclusionary zoning policies in order to keep Black and brown people out of their neighborhoods, how do you make them take responsibility for undoing that legacy?
Well, first, on the latter point, Wiener's legislation has this wealthy neighborhood bill, so even if you're not a transit corridor, you can build there. But I want people to hear this answer. I'm really glad you asked this question, because I saw this, the head of Urban Habitat in Oakland sent a message why she didn't sign CASA. And she said exactly what you said. I feel it's at risk to low-income communities who can be gentrified. And I said to her, could you name me what low-income communities you're worrying about in Berkeley or Oakland, so I can know what you're talking about? And you know what she said? No, I can't identify any. I don't know which ones are at risk. She said that. Because the reality is, I want to be very honest with all of you here. Do people know University Avenue in Berkeley? Does that seem like you think that's a low-income neighborhood? I don't. That's houses off there cost $1 million. They just sold one in Virginia for $1.5 million, 1,200 square feet. So I don't consider that one of those neighborhoods. That would be upzoned. San Pablo, I don't consider that a low-income neighborhood either. So I think the challenge is Fruitvale, which is a community of color. Houses are already selling for $700,000. So this idea, that phrase that we're imperiling, communities of color, let's talk about Boyle Heights, which I write about in my book in Los Angeles, or Highland Park. Do you know why Highland Park was gentrified? There was no development, none. There wasn't any transit-oriented development. It was a house comes on the market, and people have been priced out of the adjacent neighborhood, and so they buy that house. Same thing will happen in Boyle Heights. So not building, you know what I'm saying? When I keep trying to get examples of what neighborhood has this happened, Fruitvale hasn't had massive transit-oriented development, yet the home prices are going up. So I think the causal connection between development and saving those communities hasn't been established. And I think doing nothing has been more of a risk.
So just to be clear, I again, I'm all for transit.
Right, I get it.
It's not so much that I don't want it to come to, say, Santa Fe. It's that I do want it to come to Rockridge, or I do want it to come to the
It will. It will come to Rockridge.
And so for the new version of the bill, and this was this was the criticism of 827, that it treated every neighborhood the same. And without taking into account that there were some places that were already upzoned near transit, or that that wanted the community to have more of a say and not just have the state come in, and should have had more of a say because they've been disenfranchised and their voices taken away in these conversations in the past, and that communities like Rockridge shouldn't be treated the same as West Oakland, for example.
I talk about Rockridge in the book, and we need to upzone it, but just to be clear, the streets bounding Rockridge, College Avenue, Claremont, and Telegraph are all going to be upzoned.
Right.
So you can all go away happy knowing that. So no one's getting spared. And yeah, I think people will say, well, some may choose not to build, but there's many building opportunities at College and Claremont. You have a corner vacant lot for the last 3 years.
The new version of the bill does have a carve out for what they call sensitive communities, and we're not entirely sure what form that's going to take in terms of how you define what that is. But also, right now they're talking about having it phase in over a longer period of time, and there being a community-led process to talk about what they actually want to see in that neighborhood before, the developers just come right in. But what that process actually looks like and how people can actually take part of it. I mean, there's still a lot to be defined here, but this question was heard by Senator Wiener, and he is trying to write things into the bill. Whether it ends up in a place that is going to make everybody who raised the concern in the first place happy is still TBD, but that's an ongoing conversation.
See, I described in my section on New York City, where upzoning is destructive, is what they did in much of New York City, including Chelsea, where they take a community that's middle class, and they decide to upzone it and allow each condo in the building in the high-rise sells for $10 million and up, and they have private swimming pools. And yes, it's 25% affordable at $250, $1 million, affordable, but not we think affordable. But the gentrification, so that when we talk about development having a displacement impact, it's like Chelsea, massive upscale, but that has not happened in any of the communities in California we're talking about, and yet it continues to be floated. No one was living in downtown LA hardly when those high rises came up. So this notion that development is the engine for displacing brown and black communities simply isn't true. Now, redevelopment was, urban redevelopment, separate thing altogether, but just the building of housing has not been the engine. And yet that keeps being repeated.
So how does this all relate to the homeless situation? Because even affordable housing has nothing to do with housing for people with extremely low income. And it doesn't have much, I don't know that it has much to do with people whose homes are lost to them. So how does this work at all on the homeless?
Well, it doesn't, because what my book is about people who earn too much to get federal housing subsidies. Obviously, the reason we have a homeless problem in this country is that 75% of households eligible for federal assistance, 75% do not get it. And the number has gone steadily up. So when you deprive the vast majority of people who are in an economic crisis, cannot afford rent, and you don't give them subsidies, they become homeless. And that's something which we have to deal with in terms of something TechEquity might want to get involved with for the 2020 California primary, to get the candidates on record for where they are on federal housing subsidies, because we're not going to solve homelessness without it.
But some of the development can potentially create more homelessness, right? We understand that.
How is that?
We tear down a bunch of houses in a crappy neighborhood.
Well, who's doing that?
It's happening in Oakland, on the west side of Oakland. You go down San Pablo, you go 41st and right off San Pablo. They're building a huge apartment building. Knock down 10 or 15 houses. You put up 250 units that are $3,000 a month.
Or the houses, aren't those houses they bought from the owner?
Sure, yeah.
So
sure.
they're not causing homelessness.
They were crappy houses that probably had low rents, people, and so now you're reducing. All that I'm saying is, how do we prevent unintended consequences? And we have all this hindsight bias. We know what we screwed up in the last 10 or 15 years. How do we know that we're not going to be sitting here 10 years from now saying, shit, we never realized that all that development that we were pushing so hard was going to have all these unintended consequences, like making neighborhoods much nicer and increasing costs even more.
Well, I can just say that in terms of hindsight, everybody I know in 1982, when the homeless problem became widespread in America, we said then that the Reagan 81 budget had decimated the housing industry and would cause homelessness unless it's restored. Money's never been restored, so we've been making the same argument for 36 years. And we don't have hindsight. We know we were right, and they've never listened. And it's a tragedy that our government has allowed the homeless problem to spiral out of control. Got away with it. I described this in the activist handbook, how they got away with it for a while by blame. They'd shift, the whole media thing became a shift of, it's the individual's fault. They have alcohol or drug problems, that's why they're homeless. And as I say in the book, wait, didn't we seem to have a lot of alcohol and drugs in the 60s? Where there's no homelessness? In the 70s, there weren't people with mental problems? I think there were. What changed in the 80s? The loss of housing subsidies. And they've never recovered, never. To this day, it's tragic.
To the point of demolition, I think people are thinking about it, and it's been addressed in SB 50. There are demolition controls in that bill. So in the context of how Scott Wiener's thinking about upzoning around transit, you can't demolish current rental housing. You can't demolish rent-controlled housing. So and those have been made stronger this time around as well. I don't know, like outside of that, bill, how cities deal with demolition, but I know that people are talking about it, and it is something that anti-gentrification groups bring up in these conversations about development. James, you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned there's a difference between development and redevelopment, and how redevelopment does cause displacement. Can you kind of define those differently?
Like urban renewal type?
The urban renewal redevelopment, they just, decided it's the government just taking people's property by eminent domain and just bulldozing the Western Addition and Soma and just taking away people's homes to level it.
980 in Oakland, splitting West Oakland from downtown.
But that's not what, that's a whole different, that
it wasn't really housing development, just sort of
it requires
economic development.
Moscone Center. It requires eminent domain, which,
You talked about building more housing and also having tenant controls, and I think one place, based on my relatively limited understanding, where these actually do come in conflict is rent control. And based on like what when Prop 10 was a thing, a lot of what I read about rent control indicates that in the long run it reduces housing supply. I don't know if you believe that that's true. There was a lot of stuff floating around, and I don't have an economics background.
I'll answer it this way. I've been involved in.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on rent
You're
control.
probably talking.
Economists don't agree on it either, so don't feel bad.
You're probably talking possibly to the person who's written the most about rent control of anyone, because I'm a big proponent of rent control. I've been so since the 70s, and the study. I don't buy the studies. I've seen the studies. They've been rebuffed. The reality is, if you don't have rent control and just cause eviction, you would not have a low-income person in private housing in San Francisco. Not one. They'd all be gone. So to me, it's so obvious. And I'm really happy to see what happened in Oregon, where all kinds of groups that don't normally work with tenants came out to get that state law passed. And the same thing with CASA. You're seeing people in groups that I've never seen say a good word about tenants supporting just statewide just cause. So it's quite, that's what happens when you have a crisis. People respond differently.
Yeah, I think one important thing to note about the Oregon law and the anti-gouging bill that TechEquity is working on, that David Chu is authoring in California, is that it's not the dictionary definition of rent control, which is really like CPI, cost of living increase, or lower. I think in San Francisco it's actually lower than cost of living.
It's 60% of CPI.
Yeah, so the anti-gouging cap that we're pushing would be CPI plus a margin. So that's to get around that argument that says, new developers can't make the finances work, or landlords aren't going to be able to make enough of a return. They'll just take it off the market and turn it into condos or whatever. So it's not like, the best we could do. It's not 60% of CPI, but it does create some stability in the market, and you can plan around it, right?
Well, also, don't tell anyone this, but remember, San Francisco's original rent control law was 7%. We'll chip away at whatever, like that Oregon law, at starting high, well, it'll change over the years.
There's the CPI plus 7. I think we're proposing right now in California is CPI plus 5, so that would be about 9%.
Once you get that number, once you get the law in effect, you can work on it. You got to get the law in place.
The public line here is it's not rent control. It's rent.
No, it's not.
It is creating stability in the market for renters. We're in the middle of a crisis. This is building on existing legislation that is in act now, right, in Sonoma County after the floods. There is an anti-gouging law in California that says you can't increase the cost of goods, including rent, by more than 10% in the wake of a disaster. We're arguing we're in a disaster. And so that should extend across the entire state right now.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Are there any, like long-running studies or things on rent control? I'd be really curious to like.
There aren't a lot of really good ones.
Read
but
Dean
there's
Preston's
one from,
piece that he did.
Which one?
Dean Preston wrote one, I think it's on Medium, just type in Dean Preston.
It's not an economic study,
Yeah, no, that's fine.
but
Just
there's
like any-
there's one from Cambridge, there's one from Santa Monica,
A terrible one from Stanford that isn't worth reading.
the one,
Save
yeah,
your time.
about San Francisco.
A lot of bad data out there.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, you're going to read them, and whoever doesn't agree with it is going to say the methodology is flawed. So there's just not a overwhelming preponderance of evidence or data one way or the other. So it's easy to discount.
She has a comment.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have some friends who are architects and contractors, and they, they've told me that there is this law that requires new housing to have X percentage of low-income housing associated with it, but you can get out of it by paying this one-time fee. That seems crazy to me.
In San Francisco.
No, well, even in Berkeley, it's an in lieu fee, and I
Sure.
think legally you have to have that to sustain legal challenges. You have to. I think you always. I don't know if you could, if anyone has an ordinance says you can't buy out of it. I think you have to have a fee. I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy that you
But
can
many
just
many
pay the
people
fee to
support
get out
that
of it.
though. You sound like you don't like the idea of the fee.
Well, it seems like it's just very easy to not build affordable or low-income housing.
Well, the fee is for affordable housing, so it goes to a
Sure.
nonprofit.
It's quite small, right?
Well, now there's two different issues. There's a thing called a linkage fee, and I don't want to get too wonky. And there's inclusionary zoning. And linkage fees was very small. Oakland had a very small fee in LA, but it's risen to $24,000 a unit now. But the inclusionary fee is higher.
It also costs like $600,000.
Yeah, I mean,
optimistically to build one unit of housing. So.
Yeah, you could have. I would say that a lot of there's which way is the best way often depends on where the actual housing is. Because people are going to say, if you're getting all this housing built in downtown San Francisco, low-income families or working-class families don't want to live there, they can give the money to a nonprofit to build housing in Excelsior.
Well, this kind of builds on what my actual question was like what current laws or policies are you really excited about for mandating inclusionary housing, and what are some other ones that you would hope to see?
Well, I'm a big supporter of inclusionary housing, so I think every city should have an inclusionary housing law.
Well, what laws are really doing well in enforcing that?
Maybe talk about a little bit more about Home SF, which.
Well, when you say
What is
law,
San Francisco?
inclusionary housing is a law. It requires the developers have in San Francisco 20% of their units have to be affordable,
And is there a fee? They can pay the fee to get out of
they
that?
can pay a fee that is based on what it costs to build the housing, and the issue is, yes, a nonprofit is not going to be able to build a unit necessarily with the contribution per unit, but it might be a more appropriate unit than in a better location, so it serves the city better. The key thing is when you don't have an inclusionary law,
Oakland does not have a policy.
You don't get
at all.
any. Oakland started with their linkage fee at $5,000. $5,000. That's like curtain. It's like furniture. So now, as of last June, it went up to $24,000 a unit. But $24,000, it's hundreds of thousands are paying per unit to convert an SRO room in San Francisco is $300,000. An SRO, 10 by 10 room, $300,000. So the money, when you do it right way with replacement housing, it's an important formula to use.
The question is, what is the right percentage? And that's where, where is the balance between, and I think Home SF is a density bonus. So if you decide, if you agree as a developer to include a certain amount of affordable, you get to build a bigger building. Which in theory should give you more overall return, but then it's what is the math between the number of units to the total size of the building, and at some point the finances don't work for the developer, so they can't get the funding in order to do the project at all. So it's a really, there's a lot of argument about where that point is, and a lot of people think the developers, aren't really saying what the true number is because they want to make more money, and the developers are coming with all their I got to show the Saudi Arabian oil fund that they're going to get 20% return and all this. So it's just, it is really.
Let me tell you though why I'm such a big fan of inclusionary housing that many people don't realize, and why I think the people who are against market rate housing are making a mistake. If you say, I don't believe market rate housing is bad, it causes displacement, gentrification, let's just take Noe Valley, Bernal Heights, Upper Haight. How is anyone who isn't rich going to live there without inclusionary housing? If you open those areas up to apartments, 20% of those units will be affordable and provide a high opportunity neighborhood to families who otherwise would have no opportunity to be in that neighborhood, right? So when people say it's only 20%, well, if you're one of those 20%, that's pretty meaningful to your life. And 20% is something for those folks. So, well, it becomes a cop-out, like, what's 20%? Okay, then you get 0. That's really good for Noe Valley, Bernal Heights, and Upper Haight to have just only wealthy people living there, because that's what's happening now.
And I'll say, just from personal experience, and I'll get to you, I live in a complex in Oakland, which is actually a Jerry Brown legacy project, right next door to the Fox Theater, that Oakland doesn't have inclusionary zoning, but some negotiation happened when they built that development to include a certain percentage of affordable units and Section 8 units in that development. And I moved in 6 years ago. At the time was very, very diverse. People from doing all kinds of jobs, all kinds of family situations, the whole thing. If it was just full market rate, that would be all young tech workers right now. And it is still, to this day, there's families, I have neighbors who do different things. They're cooking different kinds of food, and that's just a much richer experience for me, not just for the people who have the opportunity to live in this complex.
And I apologize because I think I might have just used the wrong word. I guess I'm obviously for this mixed use environment. I just think from talking with developers and architects, it seems like it's too easy to not build affordable housing. To pay a fee and be like, all right, cool, I don't gotta worry about it anymore.
In lieu fees are just the way of the world.
Yeah.
Are many of you tech workers who are here? Because we haven't gotten into it, but I do really make a case that tech workers were really unfairly treated in San Francisco, blamed for a crisis they were victims of. So if you do read the book, I think you'll appreciate that. And it's really, I've never seen any previous time where people came to a city and were paying $3,500 for 1 bedroom and transit and all the other costs, and they were attacked by the population. And that's why this whole theme in my book around boomers and millennials, these boomers are just attacking millennials, even though boomers are sitting in their single-family homes paying no mortgage often, and millennials are paying $3,500, and they're the victims of the crisis. And what happened in San Francisco in 2012, the attacks, the blocking the Google buses as if they wanted people to instead be single drivers, and the media glorified it. And I discussed that in the book, so you might want to take a look at that.
Go ahead.
I think something that is probably on a lot of our minds here is, what is it that we can do?
Yeah.
And I think, I wonder if part of your question was around that, trying to understand what is up to be going on.
Let me tell you, there's hearings. Are you in San Francisco?
I live in Oakland, but
there's things going on all the time that people coming down, like as I said, it makes a huge difference when you have people coming down to support projects. Often people are working and it's hard, but keep connected. I mean, I don't know.
Join TechEquity?
Yeah, TechEquity probably keeps you connected. I know YIMBY Action keeps you connected if you follow them. But there's a huge number of opportunities to turn out to things and make a difference in this area.
I mean, I'll say, and it's not just, going to the planning commission meetings and all that, which you do if there's a particular development that you want to see happen, or, whatever. I don't know that there's what's on the docket in San Francisco.
There's a lot.
I mean, in terms of laws for if you wanted to there's all the tenant protection laws really already exist in San Francisco.
Right.
There's some stuff you could still do in Oakland, but also Oakland is pretty good. I mean, that's why a lot of the reason why we're focused on the state level, because the places where we really need this stuff and is, you know, Cupertinos aren't doing their part, and they're never going to do their part. So we got to use the levers we have available to us. So we have an agenda. We're co-sponsoring some bills that we're going to let you guys know about. We are going to need people to come to committee hearings in Sacramento. You might have to take a day off of work to do it. We're going to need people to write letters to representatives. We're going to need people to support David Chu and Scott Wiener when they're getting, you know, killed for introducing this kind of legislation. So when those times come, and I know it's super frustrating because there isn't like the silver bullet thing, the button you can press and you just have like had your influence, but this process is kind of cyclical. There will be a hearing sometime in the spring, and there will be another vote if it gets past that in the summer, and then so kind of going throughout the year. And if you join TechEquity, we'll definitely let you know when those things are happening.
All of you are on, I assume many of you are on social media, and posts about issues make a difference. I mean, you know, if you're on Twitter or Facebook, and the same people are always posting, but if someone who hasn't heard from you says, oh, I didn't know she was that interested, boy, I wonder, I mean, you will reach people who maybe aren't in the universe who already hear this stuff, so you can make your voices heard.
And last question, back.
Thank you so much. This has been super informative and awesome. I got the chance to visit Hope SF sites a few weeks ago, which are public housing sites kind of throughout the southern part of the city that are being redeveloped for greater density and to accommodate more people. I was really excited about the way they're doing it. And I'm just curious how y'all think about the role of public housing in creating like an overall affordable and accessible housing space, just because it sounds like a lot of what we've been talking about is subsidies in the private market and all that. I'm just wondering how y'all see the housing piece.
You know, I earlier spoke about the disaster of what happened with homelessness, where we decided to not fund housing any longer. In the mid-1970s, Richard Nixon decided to get the United States out of the public housing business, and it's been a rough road ever since. Fortunately, in San Francisco, Mayor Lee had a brilliant vision of the RAD program and getting funding, and we had a president at that time who would fund it. And so we're a rare success story. If you follow what's going on in New York, the grim story of no heat in the public housing. So, you know, often young people on social media are always saying, we need social housing, well, there's a history of why we don't have it. A lot of it's racial based. The reason we got out of the public housing business, a lot of Democrats didn't want, if you know the TV show about Yonkers, Some Kind of Hero, a lot of Democrats didn't want blacks living in their neighborhood. So public housing was desegregated housing, and so they didn't want it. So there's a long troubled history, but really, from an economic point of view, it's the most cost-effective way for our country to house people. I mean, it's just very simple. It's for the government to own it, and yet that's been an off limits. So all we're doing at those projects, which is great, it's great, but we're not massively adding to the supply of public housing anywhere in the United States.
Yeah, I think social housing is kind of what people talk about now when they it's like public housing 2.0. In my opinion, I feel like that's like the long-term convergence of the anti-displacement and YIMBY movement. That feels like something both camps could get behind. I'm really kind of intrigued from a sort of future policy visioning point of view about what social housing could be. I don't know if we'll ever have the political will, the level we need it. We can't even get,
we're trying to keep the low, I got to tell you this because there was the low-income housing tax credit, which is did you know the low-income housing tax credit is the #1 source of affordable housing in the United States? People know that? And people are saying, well, that's not good. A tax credit? That shouldn't be it. Well, guess what? That's all we could get in the 80s to fund affordable housing.
And basically it's companies who buy credits from affordable housing developers to offset their tax bill. So it's basically a corporate tax break program that gives money to affordable housing developers, and that's the primary source of funding for new affordable housing development. So we've got a long way to go to get to a place where there's, viable public housing. Some of the ways that it's described, which I think it's kind of compelling. It's like inclusionary zoning on steroids, where, the government gives huge incentives to developers to build housing that then, they manage with a big amount of affordable housing included in the development. We'll see if we ever get there. But maybe, you know, when we're old and crusty homeowners and we don't want any of the new kids moving into our neighborhood, we'll all be against it. Right, Randy? No, we're going to grow up to be like you.
I don't think that's going to happen, and I actually think that there was just some historic, unique features to this group of baby boomers who were able to buy housing very cheap and have a lot of factors, you know, help them along the way. But I'm very optimistic, and I'll just leave folks with this. I mean, when I was interviewing people for this book around 2017 and 18, I was interviewing all these people who now become famous because their causes are succeeding. Greg Cesar in Austin and you know, Maya Rosas in San Diego. They're all like major players in their cities now because we're winning this battle. It isn't happening as fast as I would like or you probably would like. It's not going to mean that things are affordable in the next 5 years, but they're going to be more affordable opportunities. So I think keep involved because it's made a difference. All of the activism that I write about is making a difference. And so I'm very optimistic. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Please buy the book up at the front if you're interested in reading more. Join TechEquity if you're interested in figuring out how to get more involved in this work, especially if you're a tech worker. And I think there's still some food and drink in the back if you want to help yourselves. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.